Unfolding a Memory by Mark Spruce. Written in April 2026. It's funny sometimes how a memory of an incident from decades ago can come back to you for no particular reason. But then, by concentrating on the memory and trying to recall all the details, it slowly broadens out like an opening flower to bring in the wider context. The location, the other characters from the time, the feelings and atmospheres. I remember reading Terry Waite's autobiography years ago when he talked about being held alone in a dark room for months whilst a hostage in Lebanon. He said he could train his mind to go inwards and that his recall improved to the point where he could spend whole days in another world of memories inside his head and for a while forget his captivity. Expanding a single memory to put it into its wider context can be a really nostalgic and comforting feeling. Of course, I'm talking about good memories here rather than sad or traumatic ones. The less time spent on those, if possible, the better. After much thought, one initial random memory I had recently grew to encapsulate a whole slice of life back from the long ago summer of 1982. I hope it might be engaging and put the final event in this story in context. That June, I had just finished my 3-year degree at Portsmouth Polytechnic and had returned to my parents' home in Oakhampton, Devon. Whilst applying for graduate jobs, I'd managed to secure a job as a porter at the Castle Hospital in the town on the princely wage of £39 a week. The Castle Hospital sat surrounded by trees at the end of a narrow lane on the southern boundary of the small and isolated market town, which itself sits in the middle of Devon on the north boundary of Dartmoor. If ever a place in England could be described as a backwater, then this was the place. The entrance to the building was made of solid red Devon sandstone, and in Victorian times had once been the Oakhampton Workhouse. After 1948 it had been converted with the addition of some new buildings at the rear into a small 2-storey geriatric hospital. It was quiet, very quiet indeed, and my memory is that most of the staff had been employed there for many, many years. My duties, such as they were not really very onerous. I had plenty of time to hide away in the small porter's room just off the main entrance and to tuck myself in behind the door and read. The book I most clearly remember reading at the time was The Amityville Horror, which was really scary. I'd only read it in the daytime. One of the key jobs of the day was to take the lunchtime meal trolley from the kitchen up onto the wards to be passed to the nursing assistant on duty. The rattling old meal trolley was made of brushed aluminium and might well have been as old as the hospital. It had a sliding door on the side, kept in place by a piece of folded cardboard. 3 shelves inside had the plated up meals on rubber non-slip mats with aluminium covers over each plate. I would push the filled trolley from the kitchens across to the knackered old lift in the centre of the building. There was barely room inside the lift for myself and the trolley, but once inside I would close the outer door and then pull across the brass latticed inner door before pressing the ivory button to take the trolley up to the wards. Once the meal was over, I'd return to collect the trolley and bring it back down in the lift. What I discovered quickly was that there was usually at least one main meal and occasionally a pudding that had not been touched by a patient. I realised that if you pulled open the latticed inner door whilst on the descent, the lift would stop abruptly between floors. In that quiet, cramped sanctuary, I could then take out the uneaten meal and help myself to a free cooked lunch. Time was of the essence, of course, so I had to bolt the food down before my absence was noticed. I'm surprised I didn't get indigestion, but I guess my constitution was younger and stronger in those days. One of the many characters in that building was my fellow porter John. He would have been in his late 30s at the time, tall, thin and strongly built, with a neatly trimmed dark beard. He'd greet everyone he met in his thick Devon accent with, "All right, my lover?" From the stories he regaled me with of his various female conquests, he was allegedly Okehampton's leading Lothario. I regularly saw him flirting with the nurses, and in some ways I was envious of his comfortable self-confidence around women. Whatever it was, then John certainly had it. He was without doubt a lovable rogue, and always seemed to have some little scam or money-making scheme on the go. The one I remember clearly was his having 2 jobs at the same time. In the summer months, to take advantage of the much heavier tourist traffic, the Owl's Foot garage on the eastern edge of the town was open throughout the night. John worked there through the night on the pumps. In the daytime, he would come back into the hospital, bleary-eyed for his porter's shift. He'd plough on doing the minimum necessary to get him through until lunchtime. He'd then give me a £5 to cover for him while he tucked himself away in a quiet, remote room in the hospital to catch up on his sleep for most of the afternoon. Somehow, he charmed the nurses in the know and got away with it for several weeks. Another character and permanent fixture in the hospital was Phyllis the cleaner. Phyllis, as far as I could tell, might well have been at the hospital since its former incarnation as the town poorhouse. She lived in a tiny flat in the hospital grounds and spent her days pushing a mop slowly and methodically around the wards and other parts of the buildings. She was what we might describe today as a special needs individual. Back then she would more probably be described as simple or not the full shilling. She was short, stocky and round, and always wore the same faded, flower-patterned smock. Due, I think, to alopecia, she had only the thinnest wisps of hair on her wide head. If you remember Les Dawson and Roy Barraclough when they used to do their hilarious Sissy and Ada sketches, Phyllis looked very much like Les Dawson's Ada. I'd see her sometimes sat on a bench at the back of the hospital by the bins, smoking her Waits cigarettes. If I'd heard of Waits cigarettes at all, they were a brand from the 1930s or 40s, more associated in my mind with things like Navy Cut or Capstan Full Strength. She'd sit there alone, legs apart, and her skirt hitched to her knees over her wrinkled stockings, contentedly puffing away in the sunshine. On seeing me, she would always offer a cheery welcome of, "All right, boy?" "I'm fine, Phyllis, thank you. How are you?" I'd reply. "Oh, I be just dandy, thank you. Just dandy," she would say with a contented, beaming smile. I felt like Phyllis was a round peg in a round hole, getting just the right amount of community support she needed. As for the patients, there are 2 incidents I clearly remember. The first was regarding Mr. Crystal. Mr. Crystal sounds like he could have been a character from a children's fantasy novel. I'd see him in the mornings, sat up, stiff-backed, in his pressed, striped and collared pyjamas, benignly watching the goings-on across the ward. He was very thin, probably in his mid to late 70s, and I got the feeling he'd once held a senior rank in the military, perhaps. As I walked onto the ward, he would be sat there, ashtray on his lap, quietly puffing away on his cigarette, watching the goings-on around him. Amazingly, back then smoking was not just allowed in the hospital grounds, but actually on the ward. His right leg was missing below the knee, and I was told it had been amputated due to gangrene, probably due to the smoking. Presumably, even this major affliction was still not enough to make him give up, though. As I approached the end of his bed to say good morning, I clearly remember one occasion when he smiled at me and said, "Dear boy, would you mind awfully fetching me a cup of tea? I'm absolutely parched." I cannot remember if I actually fetched him one or got a nursing assistant to do it, but the fact that in that moment he seemed to regard me as his batman certainly made me smile. The recall of the second incident is what started this whole reminiscence. If the hospital was quiet during the week, it was positively soporific on a hot, sunny Sunday afternoon. For a few weeks we had an old farmer residing with us in a bed at the far end of the male ward. Despite his terrible leg ulcers, he would always give me a cheery good morning when I came onto the ward. Every Sunday afternoon his two brothers would come in to visit him. They were three bachelor brothers who had spent their whole lives working on the small mixed farm they had inherited from their parents. The two brothers would arrive still wearing the smart clothes they had worn to chapel that morning. I imagined it might have been the only day of the week when they were not in Wellington boots and wearing old trousers held up with baling twine. That might just have been my imagination. Greetings were passed between them along the length of the ward, and I'd find them a couple of chairs so they could sit either side of their brother. The laughter and the banter would start immediately, and after updates on the goings-on the farm during the week, their conversation would settle down into something more subdued. One of the brothers would get out a pack of cards, and the other a small bottle of whiskey from his pocket. They'd then ask me to draw the curtain around the bed, and good-naturedly asked me to keep an eye out for the ward sister. On Sunday afternoons, the nurses seemed to come up onto the ward quite infrequently, unless someone sounded their bedside buzzer. There's an old saying that goes, "Devon born and Devon bred, thick in the arm and thick in the head." Well, I guess that could be applied disparagingly to some of the people from most rural counties, but it certainly didn't apply to these three brothers. I'd sometimes listen for a while outside the curtain as they talked knowledgeably about domestic and world politics, whilst quietly playing cards, sipping whiskey, and keeping their brotherly comradeship. One particular Sunday, I returned to the ward about 4 p.m. near the end of my shift and noticed the curtain was still drawn around the farmer's bed. The hushed chatter was still going on between the three of them when I pulled back the curtain to let them know it was nearing the end of visiting time. "Are you three still putting the world to rights?" I asked jokingly. All three looked up at me for a moment before the one in the bed replied, "Aye, boy, we done it last Sunday and all, and bugger me if it didn't go wrong again during the week." We all laughed, and I've never forgotten that moment and his quick-witted reply. I wonder what those three lovely old chaps would make of the world we live in today. As I said at the start, it was recalling that incident that set me off remembering further characters and incidents from 45 years ago. That whole world and those people are obviously now long gone. The hospital closed in 2002, and apart from the listed Victorian entrance building, I believe the rest of the old hospital was demolished and replaced with yet another housing estate. Writing and recording this memoir is just my way of preserving characters and incidents from a long vanished world. Spruce Casts, an eclectic collection of anecdotes, reflections and stories by Mark Spruce.